Hi. Hi, this is Alex. Welcome back to my channel. It's been longer than I anticipated. I definitely had hoped to film a little bit more in April than I actually did. But you know, things just got a little out of hand, as they tend to do. And as I mentioned in my last video, it was my birthday, so I ended up taking a little bit of time just to myself. I took a vacation from work so that I could just relax, recharge myself, and read, of course, because we did a lot of reading this month. In this video, I'm going to talk about what I read for the month of April for the Book Roast Magical Readathon, and I am also going to go over what I'm reading for May. I totally intended to film my May TBR and show you my TBR game and how that works and how I choose my TBR every month. And then I didn't do that in time, and now I just think it's a little bit too late, so I'm just gonna review what I ended up picking for the month, and we'll have a bit of a talk about those books, because I've already started a couple of them and I am very into them already. As I mentioned in my last video, I did the Book Roast Magical Readathon last month, and I took on a very hefty project of reading 8 books last month, and surprising everyone, but mostly myself, I did it. I've never read that many books in 1 month ever in my life, and honestly, I'm shocked. Like, I'm not a fast reader. I'm actually quite a slow reader. Like, I've had years in the past where I have read 5 books for the whole year. Like, I don't read fast or well usually, so 8 books in a month is honestly the best I have ever done, and I am just like truly enjoying the afterglow of this victory for myself. So what this means in terms of the readathon is that I am now done my first semester of necromancy. So my character, Kalaya, who I talked about a little bit in my last video, she is now halfway to being done her first year of her necromancy course, which I think is just super cool for her character, because the way I've sort of characterized her is that she's very quiet, doesn't get along with people very well. She's really into sort of the taboo blood art kind of thing that is part of the Iltyrian lore in the Aurelium setting. And I think that necromancy is sort of just such a left turn for such a timid kind of person. So I'm really excited to keep going with this and like sort of keep fleshing out her character as we go along with this readathon. So yeah, 8 books. What all did I read? Well, I read exactly the books that I told you about in the last video, but now I can actually tell you about them because I've read them. As I mentioned in my last video, I love going into books without knowing what they're about. I typically don't look up anything about these books. I may have heard a recommendation or some kind of like genre information from someone on Bookstagram or from a friend or something like that, and they got me interested enough to pick the book up, but that's usually all I know going in, and typically, because I am who I am, I usually forget that by the time I go into the book, and then I'm freshly surprised, which is always great fun. So this time, that's kind of exactly how it went. I knew very little about any of these books going into them, with the exception of the first one, because it is a reread from high school. So without any more rambling, I'll go ahead and tell you what I read last month. So the first book I read this month was for my Spells and Incantations class, and the prompt for that was to read a short story. So I chose to read The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. This one was a reread for me. It was sort of typically boring at the time when I was in high school. You know, it's just one of those prescribed reads. You don't really want to be reading it. It's a little bit morbid and not necessarily in a fun way. So it was kind of a tough read back in the day. And honestly, rereading it, I think it was sort of an even tougher read, especially in the context of sort of what North America and sort of the greater world at large is turning into. So kind of the concept of the story, if you haven't read it before, is that there is a lottery held every year to basically pick someone to be a human sacrifice for this town, so that their crops will flourish, everybody's moisturized, whatever. I half-assed that turn of phrase, please excuse me. So what I thought was interesting about this book was I read The Haunting of Hill House last year, and what I'm noticing about Jackson's work is that she likes to talk about how people in general are 100% willing to sell any other given person to Satan for a single corn chip. That's basically the whole point of both of these pieces, from my perspective. It's we had someone who was clearly going through something in Hill House, which was nothing like the show, by the way. I don't know if anyone else has managed to drive that point home yet, but they are extremely different. And frankly, I think the show was better. That's my hot take. Anyway, so the whole point of Hill House for me was basically that all of these people were completely willing to put this one person out on her ear because she's causing problems for everybody else. And then that ends poorly. And then also in the lottery, everyone's like, oh, well, we're all a very tight-knit community, but we're going to have to kill one of us to make sure that the crops grow. And it's like, really, though? And in the story, they also admit that other towns have already done away with their lottery, so, it's not outside the realm of possibility to just not kill one of your friends. Shocking. So anyway, I think that Shirley Jackson was onto something, honestly. So the lottery was, kind of a downer, but it was nice and short, so I appreciated that. Ultimately, I rated the story 3.5 stars, mostly because it was a little dry. At this point, it's getting a little bit dated. Also, there's some, reinforcing of gender roles in there that I didn't particularly enjoy, but, I know it was a different time. I'm not going to harp on it. So the second book that I read was Gumbo Yaya by Oriel Marie. I read this book for the animal studies prompt, and the prompt for that class was to do a quick read. I chose Gumbo Yaya because it was, one, in stock on my library's digital platform Libby, and also because it's poetry, and typically I can get through poetry quite quickly. What I think I forgot to take into account, even though I read sort of the premise of this collection before I got started, was that there was going to be a lot of heavy material in this. And I mean, as there should be, that is not in any way a criticism. Just, I think I misjudged how much sort of emotional time I would need to digest this book and really work with it. I think given the constraints of what I was trying to do in the month of April, I do need to go back to this book another time and read it again, because there's a lot of extremely important stories being told in this book about being a Black woman, about being a Black person in the current world that we're living in, about the deep grief and anger that comes along with that, and that comes along with dealing with the events that are unfolding now and the fallout and implications of those events. And then of just existing as a Black woman or Black person in a modern context. And it was so deeply emotional, and I could feel the catharsis in the words that were on the page. It was beautiful. The poetry was stunning, and the stories were so important, and I really had a profound experience reading this book, and I think that everybody should read it. It is relatively short, and again, it is poetry, so it does read pretty quickly, but if you take your time and sit with it and really absorb what it's trying to tell you, you're going to have an excellent time. And it's going to teach you something important. And then you can take, as Marie calls us to do twice in this book, is take the book, take the words, and then go and do something with it. And I can't think of a better sentiment to close that book out with. Unsurprisingly, I rated the book 5 stars. It was fantastic. Everybody should read it. And it's definitely a book that I'm glad that I read this year. So my next book was for my demonology class, and the prompt for demonology was a book with shadow in the title. The book I chose was The Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This book was great. I did have some complaints about the writing style, but I thought that the concept behind this book was fascinating. It deals a lot with feminist issues and with issues with the patriarchy, sort of on a larger scale. It deals with power dynamics, and obviously there's a death god involved. So basically what happens is Cassiopeia is sort of an outsider in her own home. She essentially works for her grandfather, and she one day opens this chest that her grandfather has and releases the bones of a death god. And they go on a cross-country tour to collect missing pieces of this god so that he can once again rise to power over his brother, who is the one that put him in the chest, or the one who instigated putting him in the chest in the first place. The book is set in Mexico in the 1920s. The vibes are incredible. We got a lot of like Art Deco kind of influence on the setting, which definitely comes through in the description. And it's definitely a story about Cassiopeia sort of finding herself and growing to become the woman that she deserves to be. I did have some complaints about the book. Mostly the complaints were to do with the writing style. So it was, for anybody who's taken any form of creative writing class in their life, you've probably heard the phrase show, don't tell. And the idea of that is to create a more visceral experience for your readers and to really suck them into a scene, make them feel like they're there, make it feel real, as opposed to telling people about it. I found that there was a lot of telling in this book and not as much showing as I think could have been done. So I honestly think this book could have been a lot longer if the writing style sort of changed to a more immersive style. However, I think this may have been the point, because this did have a tone that fit more of like a fairy tale storytelling tone of voice rather than an immersive experience. And I think that might just come down to taste. So personally, I prefer more of an immersive experience rather than sort of a classic storytelling experience. So that was one of my two gripes. The other one is there was a particular relationship in this book that was going extremely well throughout the whole thing, and then right at the end it felt extremely forced. And again, I think we really could have just expanded on that and made it a more true to character experience. So I just think we slightly missed the boat on that. I rated The Gods of Jade and Shadow 3.5 stars for sort of the above mentioned reasons. For me, the writing style pulled me out of the book enough that this actually took me several days to get through, and it's not terribly long. But it took me several days to read just because of the storytelling style. It just was not pulling me in, even though I found the story itself rather compelling. So that's mostly why I rated it 3.5 stars. My next class was Conjuration, for which I had to read a book with a source of light on the cover. I chose to read Embers by Richard Wagamese. This book is another one that I'm going to be revisiting, and in the very short future, because this book is absolutely stunning. It's such a great concept for a book, and I'm glad that he chose to publish these words into book form. Essentially, what the concept of this book is Wagamese meditated daily in the morning, and he would do so with paper and a pen with him, and if thoughts came to him while he was meditating, he just let them flow out onto the page, and he was left with short pieces of thought. And so what ended up coming of that was he put them all together into this book, and now we get to share in those sparks of meditative wisdom that came to him just on an average morning when he was doing his meditation, which I just think is absolutely glorious. I cannot understate the beauty of this book, and I truly think that every single person needs to read this just for their own peace of mind, for their own connection to the greater human experience. Like, this was just absolutely spectacular. And honestly, I just think this book is gorgeous. Like, this cover, truly next level. So I rated this book 5 stars, unsurprisingly, and I highly recommend that you check this one out. So my next class was shapeshifting, and for this class I had to read a book with a creature with claws on the cover. So in my last video, I talked about Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, and we talked about how this little dude here doesn't technically have claws, but real hedgehogs have claws. So that was my reasoning for choosing this book. Also, I desperately wanted to read it because Convenience Store Woman actually changed my life. Earthlings? Oh, if you're going to pick up this book, I want to give you so many content warnings. There was a lot in here. There was... content warnings for child abuse, sexual abuse, cannibalism, like, I'm sure there are some that I'm not even thinking of. There was a lot packed into this book. Again, this one was not long, but there was so much discourse jam-packed into this about basically how neglecting children, in particular female children, can warp their sense of reality and cause them to make certain decisions that are not in any way, shape, or form something you would think a child would think of, but when their perception of reality is so distorted, it all makes sense. Ultimately, this book was a work of art. It was genius. I loved it just as much as Convenience Store Woman, but my god, did it take what Convenience Store Woman did and dialed it up to like 1,000. I have almost no words for this. It was a wild ride. It dealt with some extremely heavy things. I never quite figured out how to pronounce the name of the planet they kept talking about, and I'm not going to try again because that was embarrassing enough the first time. Another thing that I thought was really interesting about this book was that it kind of took the idea of the magical girl trope, which anybody who reads manga or watches anime probably knows what a magical girl is, and it's kind of what it says on the tin. But this book took that concept and warped it into, again, that child's skewed perception of reality based on abuse. This book was incredible. If you have the capacity to think about reading this book, I highly, highly recommend it. It was absolutely incredible. I rated this, again, unsurprisingly, 5 stars. I ended up with several 5-star reads this time around, honestly, but like, truth be told, these books are all bangers, so like, sorry, but also not. My next class was lore, for which I had to read a book based on mythology. So I read Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I'm really glad that I finally got through this book. It has been haunting me for months because I got started and then just never got through it. Because it was really good, and I have this thing where if I encounter a good book, I don't want it to end, so I stop halfway through and then leave it for years on end. So I'm really glad to have this one finally out of the way. And I really liked it. I thought it was a very accessible way to get into Norse mythology and to just enjoy the stories in a very accessible, modern writing style. And the reason I say this is because I was concurrently reading the Poetic Edda, which I am going to briefly talk about next. And it's like I think it was adapted from Old Norse. I don't know if it might be a linguistic successor to Old Norse, but it also may have just been Old Norse, I'm not sure. Anyway, it was a translation of that, and so the reading level of that poetry was very, very high and not as accessible as this was. So it was very helpful for me to read them both side by side because I was able to get more meaning out of both of them by getting to compare and contrast them as I went along. This book is not necessarily... I don't necessarily want to say true to life because mythology sort of inherently is sort of magic realism at best, I think, would be the way I would frame it. They're all allegories, right, to help us understand real life. However, this is a piece of creative fiction, So Gaiman took the poetic Edda and the prose Edda and then also added his own twist to some of this. So this is not necessarily the closest modern rendition to the original source text that I would have liked it to be. That is nothing against the book, though. Like, I think he took the right approach. It's just that for me, I was sort of hoping for something a little bit more like Edith Hamilton's mythology, which is a Greek mythological omnibus, basically. And I think that this wasn't that, but it was still really good. I ultimately ended up rating it 4 out of 5 stars, just because I kind of wish it would have been a little bit more in depth into some of these things, a little bit closer to the source text. And I know this is a stupid criticism, I also wish it was longer. Like, we got a very limited number of stories in here, and I kind of wish this book was like this thick with more stories. So I'm gonna segue from that into my next read, which was for Inscription, and for Inscription I had to read an intimidating book. My intimidating book was the Poetic Edda. It was 434 pages of translated Old Norse. Oh, it was very difficult. It reminded me very much of reading, like, Beowulf when I was in my English degree, or, like, Chaucer. Like, it was very much sort of that level of in-depth poetry, and it was a lot to get through, a lot to understand, and there were limited footnotes. I read the Benjamin Thorpe translation, which I found for free just on Google and downloaded it to my phone. It was good. It's kind of hard to rate something like this because it's sort of, again, one of those sort of seminal literary texts that sort of transcends any kind of modern star rating system. So for the sake of argument, I rated it 4 stars just because honestly, I was expecting more about the gods and a little bit less about Sigurd, and he slayed the mythological dragon Fafnir. That's his whole thing. But then there was all this political intrigue, and people died. He died, other people died, everyone was killing each other. His, like, first wife went on a rampage and killed a whole bunch of people, and then her whole family was killed. There was, like, there was a lot going on. This was very much, like, Game of Thrones level, political stuff, and it was all done in poetic verse, and it was very long. I don't know how better to explain it. It was long. It was a very academic read. I'm glad I read it. I will probably read a different version if I were to read it again, just to, like, get someone else's translation that I might get more or different meaning out of. Perhaps one with more footnotes. Yeah, it was a journey. We got through it. I finished it. So I have proven to myself that I can do hard things. And that's what I'm choosing to take away from this experience. All right, and my last class was Restoration, for which I had to read a book about healers. So I ended up choosing a nonfiction book called You Are the Medicine by Asha Frost. I don't know what I was expecting going into this, but I was so uplifted and comforted by this book. In the introduction, Frost kind of welcomes everybody into the circle. I always sort of feel, and I think rightly so, as a white person, I feel out of place going into Indigenous literature just because I feel like this is a healing experience that I don't necessarily need to be part of. But I'm still naturally curious, and as part of the demographic that has done this, I was raised Roman Catholic. I'm not Roman Catholic anymore, but I think that I need to acknowledge and take ownership of what my old faith has contributed to this whole problem. I'm sort of just interested in how I can help to facilitate the healing process, right? Which I definitely found in this book, but what I found also was healing for myself. I don't necessarily want to get into my whole history, especially not yet. This is my second video. Like, we don't need to... I think we need to know each other a little bit better first before we, like, get into that. But we went through basically 13... Well, kind of as it says on the cover here, we went through 13 moons of healing different aspects of the spirit and connecting ourselves to the world at large, to the environment, to ourselves and our own personal spiritual history, regardless of who we are. There was definitely a lot of this book that was geared towards Indigenous people specifically and towards people of color more broadly. And those are definitely aspects that I do not need to take for myself. I'm glad that I read it so that I can empathize with others who are going through that portion of their journey. But for me, I definitely got a lot of emotional healing out of this. And actually what I thought was really uplifting for me was that Frost talks a lot about her experience with lupus. From what I understand, lupus can be an invisible disability depending on what sort of phase you're at in that disease or disorder, or however we want to frame it. I have known some people with lupus and I never knew until they told me, which is why I would personally frame it as an invisible disability in the same way that my disability is invisible. So I didn't talk about this in the last video, and I probably won't talk about it too in depth here. We can talk about it later. But I have a disorder called osteogenesis imperfecta, which means that my bones are very brittle. So I do not look in any way disabled, but existing in the world is inherently very dangerous for me, and I can go from perfectly fine to in a wheelchair in a matter of hours. Obviously, there are some things that happen in between those two states, but like it's hard to live with, and it's hard to manage, and it's hard to deal with emotionally. And I was really able to, I think, connect with Frost on that level, coming at it from the perspective of someone with a disability and who has to like live with that and find healing within themselves in relation to that disability. So I don't know if anybody necessarily cares about all of that. So like, if you listen to me, thank you. And if you are also disabled, I see you and I empathize with you and I love you. So anyway, this book I rated a massive 5 stars, and I plan on using this book extensively because it's laid out in such a way that I can now take it into all of the moon cycles going forward and do sort of a deep dive into every chapter as the moons come about and do some deeper healing processes within myself based on what is in this book. I think I'm going to be picking this book up moon after moon after moon every year for years to come as part of my healing journey. So typically every month I choose my favorite book that I read throughout that month. And this month that book was You Are the Medicine by Asha Frost. I got so much out of this book, and I learned so much about things that don't necessarily pertain to me personally, but that pertain to the people around me. And it was a beautiful journey, and I'm so happy that I read this. So if you are looking for something to make you feel good and to make you a better person, I highly recommend checking this book out. So that's it for the April TBR magical readathon situation. I'm so glad that my girl gets to be a necromancer, probably. I have to read 8 books again in August, and I think that might kill me. But you know, after having done this the first time, I think I have high hopes. We're just gonna see how it goes. I'm not gonna get stressed out about it. We'll worry about it closer to August when we have our prompt list. Okay, so I also really wanted to talk about my May TBR, which I did not film the game for. I've got this whole game. It involves like the lunar cycles, it involves tarot cards, it involves dice, and as a D&D nerd, I had to have dice in there somewhere. I will show you how all of that works for June. We're going to go ahead and do that together later on this month, and I'm very excited to go through that with you. But I would like to show you very quickly just what I chose to read for this month. So for my TBR game, I draw 4 tarot cards based on where I land on the lunar cycle, and each of those cards corresponds to a prompt that I have pre-created in a separate list. So the cards I drew were as follows. Okay, so my first card was the King of Swords. This card asks me to read a book by a male author of color. So I have chosen a book that has also been haunting me for months that I haven't managed to actually read yet. I'm going to be reading Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. My next card was the Queen of Wands, which asks me to read a book that has been very popular on social media lately. The book that I've seen probably the most of on social media lately is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, so that's what I'm going to be reading for this prompt. My next card is the Queen of Swords, for which I have to read a 5-star prediction. The book I have chosen for this one is The Memory Librarian by Janelle Monáe, which I am so excited to get further into. I'm about 30 pages in already, and it's incredible so far. And my last card is the Four of Swords, which asks me to read a short book. I actually don't have a physical book to show for this one because I borrowed an audiobook on Libby, but I am reading All Systems Red by Martha Wells. So that is my wrap up for April and my TBR for May. I hope this video didn't end up running too long. I think I may have spoken a little bit more than I was anticipating, but we had a lot to cover, so what can I say? Thank you so much for joining me. I would love it if you could like or leave a comment. Feel free to subscribe. This is only my second video, so I don't have a whole lot to offer you at the moment, but I promise I'm working on more content and I would love to get to know you better and have you along for this wild ride that I'm about to embark on. And you can find me on all of my socials at Ink and Fig. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you again in the next one. Bye!